screen?
You should be, yes, as panelists.
It says it's disabled right now, so.
Oh, gosh.
You can, if you go under shared screen, there should be an option to say multiple participants can share, I think, right?
I'm making you a co-host, so that will allow you to share the
I just
screen.
changed the settings on the participants as well on the share screen.
Oh, super. Oh, sorry.
Did you do that from the Zoom page?
Yeah, from the front page down at the bottom where it says share screen, the little arrow.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. Good thinking. Cynthia's been doing this more regularly than I have. But I appreciate it. I don't know what I'd do without her.
Micah,
So-
where are you right now?
Oh, it's 4 o'clock. I guess we should get started if everybody's ready.
I don't know.
All right. Right, very good. Good afternoon, everyone. And we welcome you to the second presentation of our lecture series. This is a very special one and for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's our annual Sylvia Suker Memorial Lecture. And Sylvia Suker was, of course, a founding member of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. She was a feminist and teacher who was a Santa Rosa resident. She passed away in 2016. And it is underwritten this year by another very good, well, several good friends of ours, Myrna Goodman, Barbara Lesh, and Michael McCaffrey, in memory of a very good friend of ours, Mr. Hans Angres, who passed away last year. And Hans inspired Sonoma State students and our community for years. We miss him very much and we will remember him very well. This presentation is one that is increasingly difficult to offer anywhere in the country in memory of survivors of the Holocaust. We offer for you this evening three members of the same family representing 3 generations and the legacy of the Holocaust for all of them. Raina Victor was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1939. She survived the Holocaust in hiding with her 2 sisters and their Jewish mother, but I will leave the details of Raina's experience in the Holocaust to her, which she presents so eloquently. Her daughter, Susan Victor, is a professor of curriculum studies and secondary education in the School of Education right here at Sonoma State University, where she teaches courses in adolescent development and classroom management. Susan is also a member of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. And finally, not least, we have Raina's grandson, Susan's son, Micah Victor Lesh, recently graduated with highest honors from UC Davis. He earned a bachelor's degree in history with minors in Jewish studies and human rights. His honors thesis was entitled Imprisoned at Home, a comparative study of Judenhäuser in Nazi Germany, 1939 to 1945. And this work examined the haphazard methods the Nazis used to ghettoize German Jews. Micah is currently in his final year as the director of Jewish student life at UC Berkeley Hillel, where he guides the organization's social justice and climate change initiatives. We welcome you all and are very, very pleased and honored to have all of you with us here this evening. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diane. Slides look okay, Micah? All right, off you go.
All right, should it just begin?
Yep.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Raina Victor, and I'm honored to be here to hopefully one day in person. But I live in Marin County, and I am a retired preschool teacher. I left Germany in 1951 after surviving the Holocaust and 6 years of post-war reconstruction in Germany. I'm here to tell you the story of my family surviving the Holocaust in Germany. Since I was a young child during that time, my recollections and memories may be mixed with what my mother told me. It is important to remember that every survivor has a unique story. I have had the honor of speaking to hundreds of students in grades 5 through 12 and college. I try to connect my story to what they are reading or learning and to their own lives in the hopes that they will stand up to racism and anti-Semitism. We will have time at the end for questions. I'm also happy to respond to any questions you email my daughter. Brief history. I understand you were provided an overview of the events leading up to the Holocaust, how Hitler came to power, and the history and nature of anti-Semitism in Germany at your first lecture. There were essentially two wars going on in Germany, Hitler's war of expansion and Hitler's war with the Jews. My story takes place in this context. The experience of German Jews was unique, as this quote from Yad Vashem describes well. German Jews defined themselves as both German and Jews. Life under Nazi rule thrust most of the Jewish population into a severe identity crisis. Germany, the homeland whose values and culture the Jews had adopted, was rejecting them. You will hear how all three of us, I, my daughter, and my grandson, feel to be both German and Jewish. We will talk about this identity struggle throughout our presentation. For example, we are comfortable speaking and hearing the German language, unlike most survivors or children of survivors, and we have returned to Germany several times. First, a brief history and a reminder of the events leading up to the Holocaust. 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. 1935, the Nuremberg laws were enacted, which severely limited the rights of Jewish people and how Jewish people could live their lives or go about their daily lives. First and most significant, their citizenship was taken. Jewish people could at first only go out, like to the market, at certain times. There was a curfew just for Jews, or had to go to a back of lines, give up driver's licenses, couldn't be doctors or lawyers or teachers, couldn't marry non-Jews, couldn't have pets even, couldn't go to school, and eventually then couldn't keep their homes or belongings and were forced to move in with other Jewish people, often strangers. Micah will talk about these Judenhäuser in his part of the lecture. November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, a night when Nazis smashed windows of stores in Jewish neighborhoods and temples. Many people were taken away. Thousands of Jewish adult men from 16 to 60 were taken away. It marked the beginning of the end for German Jews. In March of 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. I was born 2 months after the war started in November 1939. I'm sorry, I just lost my space. Oh. Here's some background about me that's important for you to know. I was born in Hamburg, which is a large harbor city in northern Germany. My mother was Jewish, my father was not. They married in June of 1935, just before the Nuremberg law was enacted, which would prohibit their marriage. I almost died as a child, and the Nazi doctor told my father to just let me die, and my father threw him out of the house. I had 2 older sisters, pictures of whom you saw on the first slide. My father owned a grocery store in the Jewish neighborhood in Hamburg. The store was vandalized by the Nazis, who painted graffiti on it like "Don't shop in Jewish stores." The tires on his delivery truck were slashed. He was called to the Gestapo after he physically stopped the Hitler Youth from vandalizing his store and was given 14 days to close the store. Friends started avoiding my mother. They crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. A close friend since childhood all of a sudden stopped talking to her. Her circle of friends diminished or became non-existent. One time, some Hitler Youth harassed her and her mother, calling them terrible things. My grandmother, who, as you can see there, was a very proper lady, swore back at them, shocking my mother. Man muss mit ihnen reden in der Sprache, die sie verstehen, she said. In other words, one has to speak to them in a language they understand. My uncle, who was still in public school, where students sang terrible songs about killing Jews, but he was forced to leave and attend a Jewish school. Eventually, that school was closed. The principal and all the teachers were later murdered by the Nazis. We were then very worried about the safety of my grandmother and uncle. They were forced to leave their apartment. The Nazis confiscated the apartment and all their belongings and come to live with us. My father, who was a German soldier, though he thought he could protect my grandmother and uncle, but eventually the Nazis took them away in November of 1941. My uncle was only 20 years old. From the information we have, we learned that they were gassed in a trunk on the way to Minsk in Russia. Tragically, his girlfriend's family was able to leave to the United States and had wanted to take him with them, but he wouldn't leave his mother and sister. My father had to join the German Air Force. Again, there were two wars going on, Hitler's war of expansion and Hitler's war on the Jews. Like many or most non-Jewish men, my father was drafted. During his time as a soldier, he helped in the underground or resistance by getting the names and addresses of Jewish people whom the Nazis were going to pick up. He actually had to fly Nazis and the generals. There's also a story about getting the Nazis drunk, and his friend and artist painted their portraits. He was then able to get more secret information so that he could protect Jews. He had a small book with notes of this information. One time he dropped it in a hotel room. A maid found it and returned it to him. He could have easily been arrested and killed by the Nazis if she had turned him in. He was arrested once in Belgium and beaten for information, but was released. He had also been arrested or summoned previous times and told he had to divorce my mother. The injuries he endured in prison affected him his whole life and probably contributed to his death in his early 70s. Two of his brothers were also involved with the underground and were killed by the Nazis. One day in 1943, my mother was summoned by the Gestapo to come to the Rathaus, City Hall. This probably happened multiple times. She was told by the SS officer that they had a letter from my father that he wanted to divorce her because he didn't want to be married to a Jew anymore, or something like that. My mother knew they were lying and said, "I have to see that letter for myself." The SS officer claimed that he didn't have it, but would get it. But in the meantime, she would have to stay at City Hall and clean all the floors. Every time she was summoned, she brought me and my sisters with her, this time as well. So she responded she couldn't clean the floors because she had her children to watch. The officer said something like they would watch the children, which of course was very frightening. My mother then took out her right hand out of her pocket, a hand on which she had only 2 fingers because 3 had been lost in an accident when she was 3 years old, and essentially shoved the hand into the officer's face, saying she couldn't clean the floors because of this injury. The Nazi officer may have been shocked, or maybe he felt sympathetic, but he let her go. In 1943, Hamburg was bombed in what was known as Operation Gomorrah. Hamburg was bombed by the Allied forces for 10 days and nights. To survive the bombing, we had to go into a bomb shelter, which was typically in the basement of apartment buildings like the one we lived in. Every bomb shelter had a Gauleiter or area leader appointed by the Nazis. This Gauleiter would not let my mother into the bomb shelter because she was Jewish. He was willing to allow the 3 of us in because our father was a German soldier. That night, the night we were bombed out, the neighbors in the apartment building essentially forced him to let my mother in. We don't know for sure how, but they either beat him up or killed him. Before fleeing our demolished apartment building, my mother threw her identification papers, which showed she was Jewish, and the yellow star, which Jews were forced to wear, into the fire. As Hamburg was burning, we were evacuated by train with almost 1 million other people to Hof, a small town in Bavaria in southern Germany. As we fled, my mother carrying me and holding the hand of my sister and one bag which contained a change of clothing and some photographs, a woman offered to carry the bag. We don't know if she took it or it was lost in the crowds of people running, but that was the last we saw of it. So all we had left were the clothes we were wearing. Hof. When we arrived in Hof in Bavaria, we were first herded into a big school gym where the residents of the town could look at us and decide whom to offer shelter. We lived in the attic of a Nazi woman who thought she was sheltering the family of a soldier. This was incredibly scary for my mother, as the woman had no idea that she was Jewish. She had to lie, for example, when the woman wanted her to come downstairs and listen to Hitler on the radio. Sie müssen kommen, der Führer spricht. In other words, you must come and listen to the Führer. And my mother always pretended she was busy with her children. My mother sent letters to everyone in Hamburg in the hopes my father would find us and realize we were alive, that we had survived the bombing. She also sent him a telegram, which is here. It says, "My dears, now we are, after much suffering and endless accidents, landed in Bavaria. We're staying in a small attic. I've already written you 3 times, but I've heard nothing back. I've also written Emil, that was my father, a telegram and 6 letters, but received no answer. He should come immediately. We have lost everything. Please let me know if my dear child is all right. Here's our address." And the child there, she's referring to is my middle sister, who actually was not with us in Bavaria. She was not too well. And the woman who later was to hide us on a farm, she kept my sister. So it was just my older sister and I. I'm sorry. We are fortunate to have the original copies of these documents, which you see in the slide. In the meantime, my father returned to Hamburg to find our apartment building destroyed. He left this note on the building. Who knows where my family is? Eventually, one of the friends who got a letter from my mother let him know where we were. He sent my mother a telegram instructing her to return to Hamburg, where he had found as a hiding place on a farm, the one that I just mentioned. Because the trains were not running on any kind of a schedule, my mother took us to the station every day until we could get on a train back to Hamburg. Meindorf, Raustedt. We realized it was no longer safe for us and we had to go into hiding. My father arranged for us to be hidden by friends of his who were also hiding political prisoners from the Nazis. Here we stayed for 2 years from 1943 to 1945. We lived in a shack that my father got and sent because he was in charge of securing and setting up prefabricated buildings and finding houses for soldiers. For those 2 years, we had basically no water, no heat, and no electricity. My mother and the elderly man who lived on the farm helped make beds for us, and my mother sewed sheets together and pillows stuffed with hay. I remember we had to sleep in our shoes, and always someone had to be on the lookout for the Gestapo. The friends never told the neighbors that my mother was hidden there, only that they were taking care of 3 children of a German soldier. I'm not sure how we got food, but we were able to plant some vegetable, and the woman got us children some food with ration cards. My oldest sister walked to a well for water, and they also rigged up some electricity from the main house, and my mother secretly listened to the radio so she could follow the war news. In April of 1945, we hear that Hitler died and know the war will soon be over. Suddenly one day my father came. He startled us. We didn't recognize him. We moved back to Hamburg and lived together until my parents divorced. Remember, Hamburg was almost totally destroyed by the bombing, so it was very hard to find somewhere to live. We lived with other survivors and then with a friend of my mother's, who later actually became my mother-in-law. I'm not sure where else, but several places with several people. Every day my mother listened to the radio because they would read the names of the survivors of the concentration camps. She desperately listened for any family member, but heard only one cousin's name. Later, my mother will realize only she and this one cousin survived. More than 50 members of her family were killed by the Nazis. Some months later in Blankenese, we were very poor and had nothing after the war. People looked at us and wondered, even asked why and how we survived. Because our parents had no money and had to get their lives together, we three sisters were moved into a home provided by the Warburg family. The Warburgs were German Jews family living in the United States who donated their house in a neighborhood north of Hamburg for Jewish orphans and children who had survived the war, but maybe had no family, or their family had no money or stable home like us. This is a picture of their house. This gave me and my sisters shelter and food and a community and a safe place to be Jewish. This was my sister's 10th birthday when she got it. And here's a painter who was in Belgium with my father. Anyway. While my sisters and I were in the children's home, my mother, who was now on her own, works desperately every day on immigration to America. It was awful for her to live in Hamburg those 6 years, and not only because of the bombed out ruins everywhere, but because she always looked over her shoulder, afraid and wondering if that person was a Nazi and had killed her mother and brother. She was an incredibly resilient and brave woman. Here are two stories that illustrate that. One day she was driving and was stopped by a police officer who asked for her license. And she replied, at the start of the war, you, in German, Mann, took my license away from me, and now I'm waiting for you to give it back. He let her go. She also refused to wait in line. For example, once at a post office, she went to the front of the line. When people complained, she said, at the start of the war, you didn't allow me as a Jew to stand in line with you. Now I refuse to stand in line with you. It was something she unfortunately continued to do here. In order to get to America, like now, people had to have a sponsor, family or friends in America who would promise to support you. It took a long time and effort to convince relatives in Illinois to provide that. My mother had an uncle who had been willing, but sadly he died. And then his 3 sons weren't sure, but finally one agreed, but only if she brought only one daughter. I was in the 5th grade then and 11 years old, so I could go half price, and I was the youngest. It was a devastating decision for my mother and was very, very hard to leave my sisters and my father. One sister came 6 months later, but the other not for 4 years. My father did not want my middle sister to come. I did not see my father again until I was 31 and my daughter was 11, which was the age I was when I left. The feelings associated with this separation never left me or my sisters. This separation was something we never fully healed from. We emigrated to America on a ship called the Queen Elizabeth. Friends who lived in England helped pay for the tickets. I turned 12 on the ship. It was not easy here in America either. I had to confront prejudice against Germans when they heard my accent, and anti-Semitism along with the racism faced by African Americans. There were signs by public pools, for example, that read "No Negroes, Jews, or dogs allowed." My mother had to quickly find work where she also faced anti-Semitism, and I had to go to public school not understanding or speaking any English. A few years later, we moved to Southern California, where I attended high school and then married another survivor who had survived after being incarcerated and taken to Neuengamme concentration camp and had 2 children. Reunion at the children's home. In 2006, I and my sister and several people, really those people there, who had lived in the children's home after the war, were invited by an organization for a reunion at the home. Here are pictures of the survivors who attended, including me and my 2 sisters. I was interviewed for a local newspaper, you see on this slide there. I'm sorry, okay, and was invited to speak to high school students in German, which wasn't easy. One student commented what it was like to meet a survivor and a Jew. Last year, I read in the Marin Independent Journal that Felix Warburg had died, which reminded me of our time in the home. Since there was no mention of the home, I sent a letter to the paper. No. This is, okay, this is a picture of my mother's immediate and extended family at a wedding in 1922. We got this picture from a cousin in Illinois. My mother could not tolerate having it in her apartment. It was just too painful. Only 2 members in this picture survived, as I told you earlier. Only my mother, here she is with the bow, and a cousin, and the aunts and uncles and grandparents. This is an incredible picture because it showed the whole family. It's just as I told you earlier, I'm sorry. My mother and 1 cousin survived the Holocaust. It now hangs in Susan's house. Germany has taken responsibility and made efforts to make the history of the Holocaust public, to display reminders outside where everyone can see. The Stolpersteine are an example. There are currently more than 75,000 of these stumbling stones that you see in this slide, in 1,200 locations in 26 countries for victims of the Nazis. There are small brass plaques installed in the locations in 26 countries for victims of the Nazis.
Right here.
Okay, so there, that's what I just read. Or in this, they were installed in the sidewalk or driveway at the last known residence of the victims. The wait list to get one is 6 months or longer. My sister and I had these 2 placed for our grandmother and uncle to represent the family only. And just last month, a Stolperstein was installed for my first husband's grandmother, who was killed in the Theresienstadt ghetto. My grandson began to do the research and to make the arrangements to have this Stolperstein installed in 2017. The artist Günther Demling says the goal is to recover the humanity and identity of victims by placing the stones on their last known residence. He also explains how important it is for young people to know and remember their history by seeing it everywhere, to remember that even in a land of Dichter and Denker, poet and thinker, this could happen. The social justice lawyer and writer Brian Stevenson talks about the Stolpersteine as an inspiration for the lynching memorial in Alabama. There are other public memorials throughout Germany. like railroad tracks listing deportations and signs on stores that had been owned by Jewish people prior to the war. More visits to Germany. You know, unlike most survivors, I have returned to Germany a few times. I have some non-Jewish cousins still there. And as a German Jew, I still speak German, as I mentioned earlier, although it is upsetting that sometimes Jewish people get uncomfortable when they hear my accent or hear me speak German. I still feel somewhat connected to Hamburg, although I could never live there again. I have been invited to speak to high school students in Germany and to students who had never met a Jewish person, as I did in 2006 at the reunion. And other times, most recently in 2017, to visit my grandson when he was doing his research in Berlin. Here we are close to the Brandenburg Gate, and this was a street where Jews weren't allowed to go. But of course, there we were. Why I tell you my story. This quote from Elie Wiesel explains what the Holocaust in my experience means today, why I talk to students, and why my daughter and grandchildren know and help me share my story. As you listen to the lectures this semester, please consider how the Holocaust is relevant to your education and to your lives today, how racism and anti-Semitism, prejudice, scapegoating against immigrants, Asian Americans, Muslims, gays, and transgender people are present in our lives today, not only in person, but on the internet. And here's a quote from Elie Wiesel. For the survivor who chooses to testify, it is clear his duty is to bear witness for the dead and for the living. He has no right to deprive future generations of a past that belongs to our collective memory. To forget would be not only dangerous, but offensive. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. Thank you. The last slide shows you important information about Jewish population in Hamburg before and after the Holocaust. It places my mother's story in the context of larger numbers. You don't want me to read this, do you?
Sorry, little transition moment here. I'm a tiny bit taller than my mom.
The chairs, isn't it?
No, it's okay. So as Diane said, I'm a professor in the School of Education. I have been at Sonoma State since fall of 1999, actually. And I teach in the single subject credential program primarily. It's what I'm going to share with you here is not an identity I really bring to my work as a professor here, at least not explicitly. And in fact, this is only the second time I've told this publicly. The first time was at the lecture series 2 years ago. It felt risky then. It feels a little less risky now. I think there are some of my students in this class. But it's gotten crucial to tell it publicly. My story as the daughter of Holocaust survivors begins with two conversations, one with my grandmother, my mother's mother, in her apartment in this picture in San Francisco. It takes place when I'm 12 years old though, and watching my grandmother cook dinner. Warum denkst du, kommen sie so spät? She asked me. Why do you think they are coming so late? Referring to my parents who were working. That was the first time she spoke German to me. It was the start of my lessons though, and not just of German. Prior to that, I had only occasionally heard she and my mother speak German, never my father. This conversation marked the beginning for me of learning their story. 4 years later came my first trip to Hamburg at the age of 16. As someone who teaches adolescent development, I know and understand the feelings of confusion and fear I had as a teen, intensified by the look on my grandmother's face, the anger, the fear, really maybe panic. We were forced to go to Hamburg because we had to move my father's mother into an assisted living facility. It was incredibly brave and generous of my grandmother to do that because I don't imagine she ever wanted to return to Germany. That trip was followed by which was, I know now to be such a significant marker in my own identity formation as a teen, was followed by 5 more trips alone for me to see my father's mother because he could not go. I should stop to explain that my father was also half Jewish. He had a Jewish father and a German non-Jewish mother. His mother, who remained in Germany, obviously, was actually the daughter of Adolf Schoenfelder, who became the mayor of Hamburg and president of the state senate, the Bundestag, after the war. I always wondered why during those 5 trips alone, why my father never went to visit his mother. His father, who was a well-known communist Jewish writer, had fled Germany for Switzerland and then New York in 1935, abandoning his 2 sons, who were then 10 and 12. I studied German for 9 years in high school and college. I developed a relationship with Hamburg as mein zweites Heimat, my second home, over those 5 trips. None of my relatives in Hamburg ever spoke about me or my family being Jewish or about the Holocaust. At home, nobody spoke of it either. We celebrated Christmas and Easter the German way, though, with no mention of Jesus. My father watched World War II movies. He seemed to suffer many health problems. He often got angry at dinner, and he always looked preoccupied. Once, when I was in 8th grade, my US history teacher showed slides of the concentration camps. I remember one slide was just piles of shoes or gold, I'm not sure. I remember feeling like there was a spotlight on me, but I didn't know why. The year I turned 23, the other conversation took place. My father was diagnosed with cancer, and knowing I assumed that he wouldn't have long to live, sat me on the couch and in what I recall being a 10-minute conversation, told me about the circumstances of leaving Germany. His primary goal in telling me was worry that his brother and others would distort the truth. I remember very little of that conversation, but I recall feeling immobile with the seriousness of it. He didn't talk to me much, and seeing the stunned and worried faces of my mother and grandmother. I think my mother asked incredulously, you're telling her this? He died 2 years later, a month before his 60th birthday. The threads that followed my life after these 2 conversations tell you what it means to me to be a daughter of German Jewish Holocaust survivors. My mother's and her mother's story became an integrated, increasingly cohesive part of my personal and professional identity, coalesced into a purpose I can hold on to as an educator. I became a German teacher in the 1980s. I faced a neo-Nazi student my first year who drew swastikas on his work. When I asked him why he was taking German, he answered, to learn the language of the master race. When I left that job, the principal wrote me a letter of recommendation commenting on the incident and how I handled it. I remember being disturbed that he wrote I was of Jewish descent, as though he needed to keep my Jewishness at a distance. I convinced my grandmother to speak to my German classes and later to the classes of my education students at San Francisco State. To this day, I feel guilty at how hard that was for her. One time I brought her to an 8th grade English class that my student teacher was teaching, and she who could speak her mind whenever she needed to suddenly couldn't speak. And I had to take her out in the hall. And she also rarely cried, but she was crying and said, why should they hear this? I joined 2nd generation groups and experienced their marginalization for identifying as a German Jew or as a Jewish German. All the others were children of Eastern European survivors. Sorry, just jumping ahead, going a little bit wrong order here. Your family probably didn't think it was going to happen to them. Reading Helen Epstein's book, Children of the Holocaust, and being able to read only a few pages at a time because my heart raced and I felt faint as I read stories of my life mirrored in the lives of other daughters and sons of survivors. I married the son of a German Jewish refugee and had a Jewish wedding. I raised 2 glorious children, the 2 of us being careful to tell the Holocaust story carefully and consciously and deliberately, hoping to avoid 3rd generation trauma. The other conversation sorry, going backwards a little bit. The other conversation with my father on the couch has to this day left me with dark words. He used to say at dinner, the best exercise I ever got was digging graves. And dark sounds, his frequent nightmares. And dark actions, how he screamed when we wasted food, sometimes called us you people, and his fear of die Behörde, or officials, whether they were in person, in uniform, or in the mail. His fear of leaving this country, which he never did. Hamburg, which I have returned to 5 more times since age 23, including twice with my children, while still a Heimat, leads to a week of sleepless nights as I approach the trip. The first 24 hours there, I'm sometimes paralyzed with fear that I won't be able to get out, yet I feel simultaneously at home. The thread or story from the conversation on the couch is fragmented and dark and unclear and still hard to talk about. It's integrated into my identity in messy and uncomfortable ways, because of course, that's the story that has left me with second-generation trauma. What we have been able to find out, my mother, my son, and I, is that my father was arrested at the age of 17 by the Nazis, following his older brother's arrest for anti-Nazi actions. He was in solitary confinement for 6 weeks in Fuhlsbüttel prison in Hamburg. Then once they realized he was a Jew or a half Jew, they transferred him to Ohlsdorf Neuengamme concentration camp, where he was for more than a year. It was there he was forced to dig mass graves. His health, and notably his eating problems and his fears, all we now know obviously symptoms of PTSD. His brother was sent to Buchenwald. Their father returned to Germany in 1949 and was embraced by the East German communist government. His efforts to rebuild a relationship with my father were understandably rejected. My grandfather died when I was 12, the same year my mother saw her father again, and for the only time, as he also died that year. My son has bravely and compassionately and responsibly continued trying to piece the story of my father, as well as my father's Jewish grandmother, which he is going to share with you. Before I turn it over to him, I want to close by saying I remain not totally at home in either identity, because I hold a bicultural identity that really doesn't exist anymore. I have German relatives I love, and I love the language. And then I sometimes go to Shabbat services with my mother, and I feel moved by the melodies and blessings. I learned enough about Judaism to raise my 2 children with rituals and rites of passage. Yet I feel Germany is still more a homeland than Israel. Perhaps the only place the identities come together for me is walking through Hamburg or Berlin and seeing the Stolpersteine or the memorials, or being in Holocaust museums, or even sitting around the table at a meeting of Alliance members and knowing something connects us, the second generation. Elizabeth Rosner describes our experience well when she writes in her book, Survivor Cafe. We keep trying to name what we are carrying, attempting to transform it into something beautiful, something healing, something that cannot quite be let go of, cannot quite be held on to. Even now, the notion of naming myself according to the near-death experiences of my parents strikes me as both a puzzle and a certainty.
Thank you both. Those are both quite the definition of a hard axe to follow, but I will do my best here. Hi, everyone. My name is Micah Victor Lesh. I'm the incredibly proud offspring of Susan and the descendant of Reina, whom I call my Omi. I currently, as Professor Parnas said, I currently live in Oakland, California, where I'm the director of Jewish student life at Berkeley Hillel, the Jewish Student Center at UC Berkeley, where I oversee the organization's social justice and climate action programming. I graduated from UC Davis in 2019, where I studied history, as well as Jewish studies and human rights studies. I'd like to spend our remaining time here discussing what you might call the third generation experience. That is, the ways in which growing up, hearing my grandmother's stories about her experiences and our shared history, as well as my mother's reflection on those stories, have shaped my identity and perspective. You'll forgive me, it might be a bit unusual, but I'm actually going to begin by reading the first 2 pages of my law school admissions essay. I'm headed to law school next year. This is my final year at Hillel. because after many months of wordsmithing, I believe the statement captures the true weight and significance of my grandparents' stories in my life. Some of what you'll hear in this statement will repeat what both my grandmother and mother have shared. A few months ago, I woke up to an email from the district government of Charlottenburg, Berlin, Germany, with a subject line, Stoppelstein, Siebelstraße 19 eingebietet. The stumbling stone at Siebel Street 19 has been put in place. Attached to the email was a picture of an elderly man placing a small brass plaque into a hole in the city sidewalk of a West Berlin suburb. The plaque, or Stoppelstein, stumbling stone, is now one in a Europe-wide network of plaques placed in the ground in front of the last known residences of those persecuted, deported, and murdered during the Holocaust. During the Nazi era, gravestones from desecrated Jewish cemeteries were used to build sidewalks, adding insult to the painful indignities the Jews had already suffered. As if emerging from the ground and refusing to be buried, the Stoppelsteine are a subtle yet public reply to this demonization and objectification, and are one outgrowth of the country's process of reconciliation. The word in German is Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which literally means struggling to come to terms with the past. Engraved on the plaque at Siebel Street 19 were the words in German, "Here lived Regina Victor, born 1873, deported to Theresienstadt, August 20th, 1942, murdered September 4th, 1942. Regina is one of the 6 million Jews whose lives ended in the ghettos, concentration, and death camps of Central and Eastern Europe. Regina was also my great-great-grandmother." The installation of the Stoppelstein was the culmination of work I began while studying at the Freie Universität Berlin in 2017, where I conducted archival research in German to locate Regina's final place of residence. Through this research, I discovered that Regina was imprisoned in a Jewish house, or Judenhaus in German, for over a year before being deported to the Theresienstadt ghetto. Regina's story would later inspire me to return to Berlin in 2019 to continue my research and craft a thesis analyzing the network of Jewish houses in Germany. This is just one of the many important stories, some just fragments of stories, that define my family history. As you already heard, my maternal grandparents, upon surviving the Holocaust and spending 6 years in post-war Germany, never fully worked through the insurmountable wounds of the war years. After their arrival in the United States, my grandparents' silence on the topic was total. As she said, my mother was not told she was Jewish until she was 23 years old. Indeed, if the horrors of the Holocaust were discussed at all, it was only in fragments. At a young age, I learned that in 1943, my grandmother went to sleep each night in a small makeshift shed tucked behind a farmhouse, hearing the sounds of bombs destroying her home city of Hamburg and wearing shoes under her covers in case she needed to run. After immigrating to the United States, my grandfather often mused darkly that the best exercise he ever had was digging mass graves at the Neuengamme concentration camp. Despite the fragmented nature of these stories, as the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, I carry an uncomfortable awareness of their profound suffering. And in many ways, my interest in a career in social justice, human rights, and public interest law represents my own unique way of processing this history. I do not believe there is a simple cause and effect relationship between my grandparents' stories and the work I have done addressing social justice issues. However, the remnants of intergenerational trauma that persist in my family remind me that at one time my grandparents suffered, lost dozens of their family members, and were ultimately powerless to fight one of the gravest injustices in human history. It is for this reason that I feel pushed toward justice, to, with the constant reminder of a great wrong my ancestors could do nothing about then, make things as right as possible now. So those are the first 2 pages of my law school admissions essay. Hopefully you all on this call would accept me into law school if you read that. As you can tell from this statement, I've grown up processing the harrowing and in many ways debilitating stories of my grandparents in 2 major ways. The first, as you can glean from my essay that I just read, is to channel that deeply held frustration and feeling of helplessness one feels when hearing about their own family being persecuted into a passion for social justice. The second is to funnel that anxiety and stress into conducting family research, as my grandmother and mother mentioned, which I've been passionate about from an early age when my Omi began to answer every question I could think of regarding our shared history. I'd like to share with you here a bit more about the family research I conducted while in Berlin, which inspired that honors thesis that I mentioned. I choose to share these details with you, not just because this is a webinar filled with folks I'm sure are interested in history, such as myself, but because the process of uncovering a story to add to my shared family history was one of the most emotional and meaningful experiences of my life. In the process of conducting research to have Regina's Stoppelstein created, work which involves sifting through hundreds of documents, primarily written in German in 5 different archives, I uncovered a captivating story about a member of my family who is uniquely remembered to have been an early feminist, a rebellious and tenacious woman who even clandestinely wrote as a political columnist for a Berlin newspaper under a male pseudonym. Despite uncovering these and other fascinating details, which allowed me to piece together a picture of Regina's life, the process of locating her final place of residence prior to deportation was extremely difficult for one reason. There were multiple addresses associated with her name in myriad books and archives. According to an online archive based in the Czech Republic, which contains Regina's death certificate from Theresienstadt, as you saw from the first slide, her last known address was indicated as Hallensee Eisenzahnstraße 6 in a neighborhood called Wilmersdorf-Charlottenburg in West Berlin. A document found in an archive featuring various works and correspondences belonging to her son, my great-grandfather Walter Victor, indicated that Regina lived briefly at a home located at Siebelstraße 67, Siebel Street 67, just 10 minutes away from that address at Eisenzahnstraße. Further, the Gedenkbuch memorial book, which lists the addresses of all Jewish residents living in Wilmersdorf-Charlottenburg, as recorded in the 1930 census, reveals that Regina lived in an apartment at Siebel Street 19. As you'll see, this is a picture on this slide on the left of Regina herself, and on the right of the modern, what sits now at Siebel Street 19, that the Allied bombings completely destroyed the building that was previously there. After much research, I concluded for an unknown number of months prior to her deportation to Czechoslovakia that Regina was imprisoned at the living space at Eisenzahnstraße in what in Nazi terminology was called a Judenhaus, or a Jewish house, as you've heard. A Judenhaus, a phenomenon in the history of the Nazi persecution of the Jews, which has been referred to with multiple labels, was a temporary method of marginalizing, segregating, and ghettoizing Jews in Germany between 1939 and 1945. Upon my first encounter with the term, I came to find that after the Nazis took power in 1933, in addition to enacting over 400 decrees and regulations, which gradually limited the rights and freedoms of Jews in Germany, the Third Reich also instituted a lengthy series of stringent measures which restricted and ultimately prevented the Jews' access to housing and tenancy rights. These laws and declarations, which combined to form Nazi housing policy, resulted in the creation of Jewish houses across Germany, which were designed to imprison German Jews like Regina in retrofitted living spaces owned predominantly by Jews, which had been abandoned by their German or Aryan tenants after the Reich instituted laws to achieve what they called the Entjudung, or the de-Jewification of the housing market. It seemed apparent upon further investigation of Regina's story that she was taken from her home at Siebelstraße 19 and confined in a Jewish house on Eisenzahnstraße, where you saw the address on her death certificate, in order to ensure that she, like thousands of other Jews in Berlin and across myriad German cities, were sufficiently sequestered, persecuted, and ostracized just prior to deportation. A bit more history here for you. In 1939, between 1933, and 1935, growing hostility toward Jews, bolstered by Nazi decrees such as those which excluded Jews from the civil service, in tandem with a severe housing shortage in Germany, made it especially difficult for migrating Jews to find suitable housing. Among the many legislative initiatives which Hitler's government passed to achieve the Entfernung, or the removal of Jews from the housing market, forbade German Jews who recently immigrated were expelled en masse from municipal housing estates, row houses, and apartment buildings. In addition, by 1938, Jews, including Regina, who had come under severe economic hardship after being stripped of employment and forced to close their businesses, were denied leases and rental contracts by landlords. Additionally, in December of 1938, a time when slogans such as, quote, "boot the Jews out of the good, cheap apartments" could be read on most public signposts, the passage of the decree on the use of Jewish property was passed, which required that all Jewish homeowners sell their real estate and allow for Aryan landlords and tenants to immediately take ownership of the living spaces. Finally, after the first Judenhäuser were created throughout Germany following the mass eviction of Jews from their homes during the 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom, The forced removal of Jews from area-known housing complexes was officially enshrined in law upon the passage of the law concerning tenant relations with Jews, which you will see in very small letters in the document copied on the slide here. While I do not have time to delve deeper into the research process here or into the many fascinating discoveries my mother and I made while on our research trip, I can share that we found extensive evidence that the Judenhäuser imprisoned hundreds of thousands of German Jews as a preparatory and transitory measure before their forced deportation to the camps. These final holding centers included synagogues, yeshivas, which are Jewish religious institutions, Orthodox community centers, homes for the elderly, which catered predominantly to members of the Jewish community, Jewish hospitals, and even abandoned armament and textile factories. Ultimately, my finding, the argument of my thesis, was that despite the seemingly systematic efforts which the Nazis used to achieve the concentration and ghettoization of Jews in the Judenhäuser, upon analysis of the extent of their disjointed network, the inconsistent reasons for the creation, and the disordered composition of the communities of inhabitants who occupied these spaces, the degree to which the Jewish houses typify the disorganization of the Nazi bureaucracy became apparent. If any of you are interested in reading my thesis, I'm happy to email you a PDF. So I share all that with you, as I mentioned, because it captures the sort of two foundational ways, or at least palatable ways, I found to funnel, or at least channel the stories I've heard growing up from my grandmother and mother. We have a few minutes left, so I'd like to close our discussion here on a somewhat separate topic by recognizing that we are all living in a time, as my grandmother alluded to eloquently earlier, when anti-Semitism, attacks on Jewish people, and Holocaust denialism are at an all-time high. Within the last 5 years, we've witnessed mass shootings in Pittsburgh and Poway, the Charlottesville Unite the Right rallies, and the attack on the United States Capitol on January 6th, where, among many terrible instances, a protester infamously wore a sweatshirt that read Camp Auschwitz staff on it. More recently, we witnessed the hostage situation at a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, anti-Semitic flyers found in Santa Monica and San Francisco, which blamed Jews for creating the COVID-19 pandemic, and just last week, a neo-Nazi rally in Florida. As a Jew, I, like so many others, am continuously exhausted by what feels like a lifelong attack against my community, and as a grandchild of Holocaust survivor, feel helpless to somehow protect my grandmother from the same bigotry and vitriol that has caused her and my family so much pain. According to the UN General Assembly's dedication of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which we observed just last week, the purpose of remembrance is to, quote, safeguard the historical record, remember the victims, and challenge the distortion of history often expressed in contemporary anti-Semitism. All of these things are critical aspects of claiming justice after the Holocaust. I'd like to thank each of you for being here today for this hour to take part in doing just that. The three of us will, I think, collectively close with a quote from Primo Levi that my grandmother, mother, and I believe captures it all, which you can find on this last slide. And it reads, "We must be listened to. Above and beyond our personal experience, we have collectively witnessed a fundamental unexpected event. Fundamental precisely because unexpected, not foreseen by anyone. It happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raina, Susan, and Micah. And we invite everyone in the audience to write through Q&A any question that you might have for our distinguished speakers. And we'll begin the question and answer period, hearing from our dear friend Myrna Goodman, who states, "The Victor family's experience shows how deeply integrated Jews were in the fabric of German society. What is Jewish life in Germany like today?" Anybody?
I can start to answer that just based on my experience and then toss it over to you both, if that's right. Like I shared, haven't been in Germany since 2017. That was just my brief stint on a study abroad program, which was quite wonderful. In terms of Jewish life, just sharing anecdotally, it's, for lack of a better word, at least in Berlin, flourishing. I don't know if these numbers are exactly correct anymore, but from what I remember, at one point in Berlin prior to the war, there were somewhat close to 160,000 German Jews living in Berlin. And at the time that I was there was almost 120,000. Very few of them, from what I can recall, are German Jews who descended from Holocaust survivors. Oddly enough, maybe not oddly enough, I guess there's an essay to be written there. I met many Israelis when I was there, folks who had immigrated from Israel, as well as Russian. And in terms of Jewish life, one thing I just speak as someone who works in the Jewish nonprofit world that I found fascinating is that if you're a practicing Jew in this country, you know, there's lots of flavors of Judaism. You could be an Orthodox, go to Chabad, there's conservative Judaism, there's Reform, there's Reconstructionist, there's a spectrum of Jewish practice. And before, Naomi could speak to this better than I could, but before the war, there were sort of just one flavor of Judaism, which kind of looks a little more like Orthodoxy today. But when I was there, I took my parents to a Reform style high holiday service at a historic synagogue in Berlin. And there's a number of flavors of Judaism and Jewish communities there. Obviously, one thing that you observe a lot more there than you do here is security at synagogues, right? There's often a huge police presence, metal detectors, often men with guns in front of religious institutions for obvious reasons. So that was my experience. If you want to speak more to that.
So do you think in some respects, Jews returning to Germany feel that if they're going to return to Europe, it's safer in Germany than many other places?
I think it depends in what part of Germany too.
Yeah, oh, yes.
The smaller conservative towns of southern Germany, that's where there's still neo-Nazis, and but other more progressive cities like what is Hamburg really, and Berlin, it's a little bit different.
I know you haven't lived there in a long time, and Micah, you just visited for a short time, but do you think that this trust in Germany and the new generation that has arisen is well-founded? Is there a different attitude toward Jews, or is it just deeply buried?
I was very reassured during Angela Merkel's time, because she, more than anybody, who never failed to remind people of what Germany needs to do and what they have to live with for eternity, really. And she did a lot here. She was the daughter of a Lutheran minister, a pastor, and she really embraced that. So we'll see what the new chancellor is like. I don't know yet. But there's still, always, I think, at least for me, there's always a bit of a, I don't know how to say, doubt or worry.
Mhm.
But and I have a different worry in this country now. But it's still there, and it will always remain there.
It was striking when Mike and I went in 2019, right, to do some more research, and how it was just so interesting when we'd go to these archives. Do you remember that, especially in Hamburg, just how readily and I don't want to say enthusiastically, I can't think of a good word, but just how anxious they seemed to be to give us information to help us, especially in Hamburg, I would say, almost as though the generation of the workers, say in the library or in the archives, were still influenced and holding the guilt. Like, of course, we're going to help you. We want to piece together this story. This question is hard for me to answer because I'm aware that the 10 times I've been to Germany and to Hamburg and Berlin, I go as a German. The times that Mike and I went to do research, and when we went to see the Stolpersteine, that was the only time I felt I went as a Jew, if that makes sense. So I have to say, I don't quite know what it would feel like to be Jewish there.
Right. This is a somewhat related question. What is your opinion on reparations for Holocaust survivors?
You should answer that.
Okay. Well, I tell you, when, Konrad Adenauer, the Alte, known as the old one, he's the one who initiated that. And when that happened, I know my mother, had lost everything. I mean, my grandfather had valuable books. Everything was gone. I mean, there was nothing left. And she had a very hard time accepting it. And of course, it was nominal what they finally sent her. And my father kept encouraging her to accept it, but she hated it, and even the word alone, Wiedergutmachung, to make good again. Well, you can never make it good again. She lost her family completely. And now, you know, I have my sisters and my one sister is gone, but we get a certain amount from Germany. But you know, it's good, but it's one has mixed feelings about it for sure.
Yes.
Mhm.
Susan talked about not wanting to put this trauma onto those in future generations, but how do we acknowledge the history of the Holocaust and its lessons in schools without inflicting trauma?
Yeah, I wasn't saying that I think it's difficult. I was more describing how difficult it was for my grandmother to initially do so when I was a high school teacher. And I think it's true for all survivors who have chosen to speak, and many have.
Yes.
Just the enormity of getting past their own silence to convey the lessons.
Pain, yeah.
But I teach development, right? And I'm very sensitive, as my mother is too. She was a teacher for almost 20 years. You know, we're sensitive to what different age groups can hear. And I have at times brought this up at Alliance meetings, for example, as a point of discussion, that I feel differently about what each age should hear and what they can digest. And so what I did with my two children as they were growing up, you know, was really consciously and in a developmentally appropriate way, telling them the story. That's how I feel like teens should hear it. But should they hear it? Absolutely.
Good. It's an interesting question. What would you say to anti-vaxxers who wear yellow stars while protesting vaccine mandates? I saw a picture of this recently,
Yes.
and I felt extremely uncomfortable and sad.
Same here.
Well,
it's
it's appalling.
It's
hard.
appalling.
It's not even
yeah.
worth talking about. I mean,
but-
the NRA has done similar things. The anti-abortion or anti-choice movement has done similar things. I mean, this happens every time a group uses any reference to the Holocaust to further their cause. It re-traumatizes all three of us and our generations, and it diminishes the experiences of survivors and of the Holocaust.
Elie Wiesel was really concerned about that, of trivializing the Holocaust.
Yes.
He knew for certain that we wouldn't forget it, but it's so, I don't even have the right word, how they use that word so loosely and so, what's the word I'm looking for? It's really so wrong.
I mean, disrespectful does not even convey
No.
how low it is.
Well, in that vein, what is the most valuable action we can take to confront anti-Semitism? Education, of course, especially with younger generations. Is there legislation we can support? Is there an actionable thing we can do to take away from today?
You want to start, Micah?
Sure. It's not an easy question because it feels as if, and I imagine a number of people who identify as Jewish or are Jewish on this call know that I feel like we've been looking for an answer to that question our whole lives, and there's not an easy one. I think it sounds a bit cliche, but I truly believe it, that especially being in a Jewish organization, there is power to confronting the small comments or the microaggressions, because they quickly blossom, for lack of a better word, or grow into more vitriol and more bigotry. So I fundamentally believe that if there are comments you interact with, I would imagine non-Jewish people, or sort of anti-Semitic jokes, Holocaust jokes, there are things that are traumatizing without you realizing that they are traumatizing, and you know, quickly those things can dovetail into more offensive comments. So it sounds like an anti-bullying seminar, but I think it truly is very important to be an upstander when we're having conversations about this history.
And I think we were talking earlier, I don't want to get into it, but the incident with Whoopi Goldberg, and that sometimes things come up like this that detract from the real issue we should all be addressing, like the lessons of the Holocaust about scapegoating and prejudice and oppression and persecution, and the methods the Nazi used, like the Judenhäuser, like, you know, it happened, therefore it can happen again. And when we, you know, I think when we spend time talking about what is racism, what is anti-Semitism, who's being persecuted, who has privilege, all important discussions, But the real discussion has to be, what can we learn from the Holocaust, so that we can protect everyone who's
Yes.
being persecuted in this country, or marginalized or oppressed. I mean, I have not made my academic life about teaching about the Holocaust, but being a child of survivors infuses everything in what I do. You know, I 100% support people who want to be teachers, and consider myself an advocate for public school teachers and for the public school adolescents who are in the schools. So, but everything's infused by the experience of my parents, and how quickly microaggressions and, like Micah said, a marginalization can turn to violence.
Absolutely. Cynthia brought Whoopi Goldberg's comments to my attention, and I think we're all going to be discussing that incident in our discussion sections right after this presentation. A related question: what can I do as a non-Jewish American to best support and be an ally to those in the Jewish community today?
Well, for anyone, as we said before, to speak up when you hear even the most subtle, derogatory, bigoted remark, that you have to, that we all have a duty to speak up. That's number one. Perhaps, you know, in speaking up, that people will learn. I mean,
And to recognize we all have different experiences,
Right.
like any group in this country, any minority group, we hold a range of religious, political views, including how we feel about Israel. And so I think to be careful about the assumptions we make about Jews as a group in this country, they become quickly too close to hinting at anti-Semitism, or tropes that are used to talk about Jews generally. And Michael listed the events that are just all recent, up until, you know, last week.
right.
So, you know, what we need you to all take it seriously, not only because Jews are increasingly at risk, but because it means everyone's at risk. Right?
I think, oh, sorry, if I could build on that just briefly too, it's a great point you both made. I speak again from perspective as a Hillel professional working very close with college students for the past couple of years, building on what my mother just said, that in not only just in common social circles, but I found very much in activist circles or in social justice spaces, there's so much energy among this generation of college students, which I can maybe still glad myself in that generation, around activism and around standing up for what they believe in. And so much of the anti-Semitism that my students interact with is being excluded from those spaces purely because there's assumptions made about what their Judaism means, that it's purely Zionism and therefore bad and wrong and colonialist. And it's a conflation that's extremely damaging, and excludes important voices. As we know, as my mom mentioned, there's a wide spectrum of Judaism and of Jews. There's Ashkenazim, there's Mizrahi Jews, there's Sephardic Jews, there's Jews of color, Asian Jews, Jews of various descents, LGBTQ folks, the list goes on. And to label people purely based on your assumptions of what Jewish means, and therefore that person's beliefs, is anti-Semitic, in my opinion. So I think, in answer to the question of allyship, I think welcome nuance is the best thing I can encourage you to do. That just because you hear someone's Jewish, make no assumptions about what that means for them.
Do you think anti-Semitism is more virulent today than it was 10 years ago?
I would say personally, it's more public in my experience.
It's more out in the open. Public was
Yeah.
Politically speaking, we get it from both sides, which is uncomfortable, you know.
Raina, Susan, and Micah, we feel privileged to have been able to hear you today. We welcome you back again, and we hope we can see you again in the near future. We wish you all the best, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the wonderful presentation.
Yes. Good night, everybody.
night.
Bye.
Thank you.